Welcome to Brave. Be inspired by the best leaders of Southeast Asia tech. Build the future, learn from our past, and stay human in between. I'm Jeremy Au, a VC, founder, and father. Join us for transcripts, analysis, and community at www.jeremyau.com. Hey, Paulo, good to have you on the show.
Hey, Jeremy. Thanks for having me. How's it going?
I am super excited to have you on the because you're someone who feels like someone who similar souls in the sense of we're both podcasting, we're both doing content creation in terms of VC thought leadership in Southeast Asia. We both have interesting hobbies, so I'm really excited to share about how you're spearheading Insignia's thought leadership at one level, but also your personal interesting story as well.
Yeah. I think it's just really exciting to meet somebody who is also really interested in the same things that I am, in the sense of creating this type of content about these kinds of topics for this audience. I think especially in Southeast Asia in particular, or it's kind of hard to find somebody who's like doing, I guess, similar things to what I do. And I was really happy to find you along the way. I think it was a Clubhouse session where I learned about you, and then I listened into this Clubhouse session with you and Nick Nash, which was really great. And then that's how I found out about the Brave podcast. And yeah, really really great of you to have me on the show, and really a pleasure.
Yeah, really excited to go into it. So for those who don't know you yet, could you share a little bit about yourself?
Sure, yeah. So I'm currently a senior content strategist at Insignia Ventures Partners. So Southeast Asia VC firm based in Singapore, typical regional VC firm. And I guess to give a little background as to how I ended up in Insignia, I guess that might be more interesting. Is this is actually my first job right out of university. Although I've been with the startup ecosystem, or rather interacting with founders and like VC, actually since I was in high school. So I first joined my very first hackathon in 2014. It was one of the very first hackathons actually in Manila at that time. And I guess now you probably wouldn't call it a hackathon. It was really more of a pitching competition, because I guess we weren't like coding all the time. We were like a lot more focused on the pitching aspect, I guess, and the business model. But yeah, that was an experience for me. And then I ended up really liking what the organization behind that event was doing. So then I joined that organization. It's called YouthHack. They still do a couple of different events here in Manila and other countries as well. But then I joined them, helped organize some other pitching competitions, trying to get more students interested in startups. That was the whole, Silicon Valley was still showing at the time. Everybody was still trying to, get in and figure out what this whole space is. And then, in university, I started to, as I was trying to quote unquote preach this like startup gospel to students, I sort of realized I can't really preach it if I don't actually experience it myself. So I ended up trying to look for jobs in startups. So I worked for a couple of like co-working spaces and marketing agencies for startups, and then eventually found myself in a venture capital firm, and that's where I am right now, and it's been really great so far.
Amazing. And could you share a little bit about some of the amazing work that you've done with Insignia, especially in regards to thought leadership?
Yeah, so I think one of the first things that came to do at Insignia was really help in terms of creating this, as I would say, like content machine. And we started off by creating our own little version of First Round Review, or Harvard Business Review, whichever one and we call it Insignia Business Review, in case the association isn't that obvious yet. And it's just basically a blog from the firm, and sometimes we get a couple of different contributors here and there to just talk about the region, and all that jazzy stuff. And then the second thing that I sort of introduced into the content machine was we also try to do podcasts as well. So I think it came at a right time that I started the podcast at Insignia. It was around like April 2020. And just then, COVID restrictions started to hit, like events, like not many people could hold events. And so, podcasts became like a convenient way to be able to do like mind share without sort of like the hassle of, figuring out Zoom or all these like event platforms, while still getting the word out there about different things. So yeah, I helped set up this podcast for Insignia. And then I guess the last thing, and one of the really, I guess to some people might be crazy things that I did last year was actually work on a book. And I guess it helped that I was just mostly stuck at home, and still stuck at home until now actually. But for the better part of last year, I spent writing a book with Yinglan on sort of the things that we've learned over the past few years when it comes to Southeast Asian startups, and yeah, so the book is Navigating ASEANnovation. ASEANnovation because Yinglan wrote a book a couple years back called Chinovation, so now it's like South Asia, so ASEANnovation, and yeah, it was published November last year, and yeah, it's been really great because got to talk about it to different people and see how it's been helpful to some people as well.
Amazing. I mean, I think you all have really pioneered how thought leadership is being done, especially in the region at the VC level. And I think it's just really amazing to see some of the great content that you've been doing. I definitely have listened to some episodes on the podcast while going for a walk and stuff like that. Just to be like,
we gotta support each other,
Yeah, I know.
Listen to your episode.
I gave you like and subscribe.
Right. Yeah.
Smash that follow button to
Smash that
hit
the notification bell
and my podcast.
Yes. Yeah.
There you are. I mean, obviously, you're interesting because you're doing honestly, three things, transitions that are interesting, right? One, obviously, transition between university to professional career.
Mm-hmm.
The second one, of course, is transitioning from a consumer to being and writing thought leadership, right? In terms of a strategy and content perspective.
Yeah.
And the third thing, of course, is that you're transitioning from having worked at startups from the junior level to becoming and joining the VC landscape, right? Which is the other side of the table.
Yeah.
So that's a really interesting set of transitions that you had. How was that, transition for you? Did you find it fun? Was it challenging? What do you think about that transition?
Yeah, I think so those are three different transitions, right? And maybe I'll just go through each of them. I guess I'll tackle the second one first, which is you mentioned sort of like going from a consumer, because I do love consuming a lot of these like different content about startups. It's how I got to learn about the ecosystem when I wasn't going to events before the pandemic. And now that I'm in that position where I'm also creating content and sharing insights, not necessarily my own, but sort of being that, I would say, like wordsmith for these founders and investors to share their insights on the region. It's quite interesting because now you sort of understand that the pressures that come along with the weight that comes along with sharing what your own opinions or own perspectives, and I guess on the other hand also being aware of the value that it has, because it sometimes seems because it's pretty intangible in a way, like you're not necessarily really connecting it to like KPIs. I mean, obviously you can just like measure like views and subscriptions or whatnot, but like it doesn't, like especially for VC, it doesn't necessarily translate into like, oh, if somebody reads this article, they're gonna invest in the we're gonna invest in the company, or this founder is gonna join our portfolio, right? It doesn't work like that. So but at the same time you still realize that these words actually do have power and they can actually influence. I mean, how I discovered Insignia was actually through thought leadership, interestingly enough. Like, I mean, I was working in this marketing agency in Korea, like just collecting sort of names of different thought leaders in Southeast Asia. And then Yinglan was one of them because he had written a couple of articles in Forbes. And that's how I ended up connecting with him on LinkedIn. So yeah, it was pretty interesting that the same thing that I'm doing now is how I got the job, and or how I got introduced to the firm. And yeah, I think in terms of like producing content, I just remember something that I think it was my English teacher back in grade school told me, was like, don't just be a consumer, be a producer. The statement isn't that qualified that much, but looking at what I'm doing now, hopefully I'm able to actually not just like consume things, but also produce things that are helpful to other people as well. So that's the first transition. The second transition from uni to first job, I mean, I guess it's not that different from anybody else who's going out of uni and taking on their first job. But I guess it was different for me because this first job is like mostly remote. well, I mean, I guess now a lot of people are taking remote jobs for their first jobs, but I guess pre-pandemic it wasn't that much of a popular choice, I would say. And to an extent, some people even like advise me against it. Like they would say like, you know, just take a stabler job first before you try and do other things. But yeah, I was just really interested and really passionate about doing this whole content thing, so I took it anyway. But yeah, like I guess like being in Insignia and working remote for most of my time at the firm is quite interesting. It's like I've only been to the office like what, maybe like less than 50 times, less than 20 times even. I mean, if you count several days as one time. Yeah, so it's been quite interesting, and just you start to appreciate the value of different tools, right? Like Slack, like Zoom, and you know, without those tools I would be like pretty difficult to sort of coordinate with different people from different countries. Yeah, so yeah, it's been quite an interesting experience. And then the third transition you mentioned was sort of like the local, like moving from a local junior kind of like preaching to students sort of scenario, and then now working in VC. Yeah, I think it's quite different. Like it definitely matured my understanding of how startups work. Like obviously when you're working in like pitching competitions for students, it's very basic level stuff, but still valuable stuff, I would say, but still basic, and you don't really question what happens, you know, say they win the pitching competition, say they get connected to investors. You don't really think about that, right? You're just thinking about like how great is the idea, and you know, let's get investors interested, but you don't really think about what happens after that. And now working in VC, you do start to think about that, and I do start to realize the importance of what does happen afterwards. So I hope I covered everything. Yeah, that was a lot.
That's a lot of transitions. And I think one thing that was interesting was talking about, you know, the metrics for success, right? For thought leadership / content, and how it's super fuzzy, right? And I struggle with the same thing, right? Because obviously the nice thing to look at is just be like, okay, number of listens and downloads, number of readers. So I think that's like the most obvious way to look at it. But I also think to myself like, hey, you know, the audience that, at least if you're looking at it from a VC perspective, it's like the audience is really small, right? It's like what? Like 100 founders, 200 founders across the region at any one time. So it doesn't matter if you do thousands or tens of thousands. It's you know, how many of that 100 or 200 really got to have that chat with you, right?
Right.
I'm just kind of curious how you think about it.
Yeah, I think it's on some level you do want to get like a big audience, but what the word big means actually, you know, compared probably to other types of content marketing is quite different, right? Like getting 100%, you know, say you get 100% market share of the mind share here in South Asia. It's still pretty small, as you said, just like a few hundred founders, maybe a few other investors, and maybe I guess, you know, you even possibly like other foreign investors who are interested in the region, but it's still small. And so it becomes less about getting more and more numbers and actually creating sort of either like a community or creating, as I said earlier, sort of that content machine or reliable source that people, you know, sort of subscribe to or follow, you know, and I guess in startup lingo, the word for it is like retention, right? Or stickiness. Yeah, like you do want to get, you know, the right people in, and you hope that those people will actually continue to listen or continue to read whatever content you come up with. Yeah, so that's how I look at it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a key part, right? Is the core audience that you really care about, like, you know, founders who you may potentially invest in, LPs, I guess, you know, downstream investors. Those are the kind of folks that you want to make sure that you just, like you said, have that stickiness. What do you think is a successful podcast from your perspective, or content machine? How would you define a successful one for VC?
I think, you know, like it obviously, for a VC, you obviously want to tie it to the VC business model, right? So you obviously want to tie it to whether or not the content actually either brings in a founder who the investment team will eventually be interested in enough to actually follow through with, or an investor who could potentially co-invest or do a follow-on round with the startup, or a possible hire, right? Like senior leadership who eventually, like, say, finds your content, becomes interested in that company that you featured, for example, or company that you wrote about, and then, you know, begins to search them up, look them up, and then maybe even potential hire for the firm, right? Who could be really great in terms of growing the company. So, but the common thing about all those four things, all those four quote unquote use cases, is that it's really hard to connect the end scenario of, like, say, getting that hire, or getting that check-in, or getting the investor into the cap table, or whatever the use case is, with the, you know, the actual creation of the content, because you're not really able to track, right? And even if they do end up making the decision, like, I'm pretty sure it's not 100% because of that, right? But it does, like, lay the foundations. It could lay the foundations, could set the conversation. And I'm pretty fortunate that there were some times where, you know, like, the founder did message me, or the investor, you know, or an investor would send me a message saying, like, oh, I read your piece, or I listened to your podcast, really great, really helpful, learn about X and Y. And I guess even if it's not consistent, it's not a consistent feedback cycle, like, just those, you know, messages sort of signal to me that I guess I'm in the right track somehow. Even if I'm not really able to at the end, like, close the loop entirely. Yeah, at least there's that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the question all of us have, right? Because as content creators, we're just like writing messages into the void a little bit.
right. Shouting into the void, hoping somebody will shout back. And hopefully,
yeah, exactly.
Hopefully it's not just an echo of your own voice. yeah.
No, that's exactly it, right? Which is like, you know, it's nice to get those nice little, like, letters or messages just to be like, hey, you know, this is interesting. I also get messages like, hey, there's a typo here. And I'm like, oh,
actually, yeah, that's actually, at least, you know, like, actually any message that signifies that they actually read or listened, whether it's, like, positive or not so positive, I mean, it's still validation that they actually clicked the link and actually checked the content out. So it still gives a boost in terms of validating what you're doing. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting, right? Because that's the question, is like, there's a soft side, there's a quantitative side. How, when you look at the landscape, how do you see, like, thought leadership and VC kind of evolving in the future?
Yeah, I think there's definitely gonna be more, because, like, one way to see it is, before, you know, VCs were just really focused on doing, you know, closing investments, focused on company building, right? But then, you know, they sort of realized that in addition to all these, like, portfolio management stuff that they do, like, this could actually also help in terms of building their brand and reputation, which is arguably the most important currency in VC. And so, you know, you have firms like A16Z or even First Round created these, like, massive teams, like almost like separate media companies to an extent, that create, like, these that sort of control the view of the world of people who actually consume this content, right? And I think Southeast Asia in particular isn't there yet in terms of that, but I think, like, it's sort of headed there, right? Especially since there's a, you know, increasing demand for these types of perspectives, right? You have a lot of foreign investors coming in, asking questions. Probably the questions are different now. It's obviously 10 years ago, probably the questions were like, what is Southeast Asia? Where's Indonesia, right? but now the questions are, you know, what's going to happen to the e-commerce market, consolidation, blah, 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 all that stuff. So there's definitely a huge demand for answers, right? Even if, regardless if the answers are going to be true or not, there's a huge demand for these perspectives. And I think with that, you'll have a lot more ownership from the VCs, like ownership in terms of, like, we have to own the content that we create. We have to own the thoughts that we create, as opposed to simply relying on media platforms. Obviously, newspapers and journalists and media platforms will still have a large and important role to play. But I think VCs, aside from doing all these PR relations, they will want to create their own, source and their own publication to an extent, to control the narratives that they share with people coming into the region. Yeah.
I mean, you raised some really good points, right? Which is, I think the questions are getting more sophisticated, right? So even in the past, I think a general consumer was like, what is a startup, right? Now
Right,
it's
right,
like, what is my optimal fundraising strategy, right? Which is in Southeast Asia, right? Which is even more specific, right? So I'm just kind of curious, is that how you brainstorm titles or content ideas? Is it more like a bottom-up thing where people are like, they ask you questions and then you just like make them into like, titles? Or is it more like the other way around, which is like you have a big idea and then you have pillars, that you want to talk about and then go that way?
Yeah, I think it's both. Like you have to do both. You do have to listen to what people are asking, and definitely people will ask a lot of questions. Especially if you're a VC in South Asia, like they'll definitely ask a lot of different questions, especially with, from big topics like, GoTo merger or Grab SPAC, to smaller topics, I guess, with regards to like specific portfolio companies, for example. But at the same time, you also try to think about what isn't being asked. Right, so you have that part of the content creation strategy where you think about, where you consider everything that's being asked and try to answer them and use that as fodder for your content. And then there's that other part where you start to ask yourself, like, what isn't being covered yet, or what kind of angle isn't this information being, what light isn't this content being shown under, right? Like, you do have to do both things, I think.
When you think about all of that, is just like, do you ever feel like we're going to be contented out? Like
a sort of saturation. It's like
saturation.
It's like Zoom
because
fatigue, but
yeah, I know. I'm just talking out loud in my brain, right? I'm just like, because it's like, you're generating content, I'm generating content. I know a few other folks generating content. Like, do you think there'll be like, what happens when, I don't know, is there like actually an endpoint where it's like there's a black hole of content where everybody is just like, we have so much content that it's just saturated, or
I think because the interesting thing is about this whole concept of content that we're talking about, it's not necessarily data or information or facts, right? Obviously it has to be rooted in those three things. It has to be rooted in the facts and data, obviously. But it's not just that, right? It's obviously, you have the layers of opinions, you have layers of perspectives and different lens of looking at things, which I think there's no ceiling to, right? Because, it will be different for every person. As soon as a new investor comes into the community or starts their own career, they probably have their own unique perspectives. They'll start their own podcasts, start to write their own things. And I think from the consumer end of things, those who are consuming content, like, I don't think people will necessarily get tired if, especially for the people who are looking for answers, right? Or who are looking for different perspectives. I mean, obviously, if you're a person who's not looking for anything but just keeps getting fed these things, like in newsletters, for example, then you could get tired, I guess. But if you're somebody like, say, like an aspiring founder, or like an undergrad who's trying to learn more about the ecosystem, wants to think about starting their own company or join a VC, then the idea is you want to consume as much as possible, right? You want to get as diverse a pool of content as possible, which makes having various perspectives actually more important, right? You actually want a lot of people to create different types of content. And it's not really a one-to-one thing where, like in other markets where you like, I get one reader and that reader can't read your other stuff, right? There's no exclusivity. Like, people can read as much as they want. And it's just a matter then if you think about competition, your competition is really like with yourself in that sense. Like, can you actually get into the bandwidth of that person, or your target audience, right?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it rhymes with what I think about is like push and pull, right? Like there's a lot of information that people are trying to push to you, right? It's like broadcasting. Right. And I think every time we release a piece of content, we're pushing that content out, obviously. And those who actively follow us will get that push notification equivalent, right? Through like newsletter, or it shows up in the podcast feed, right? But I think the real value is actually in the pull approach, right? Where like you said, someone who's on a hunt for something, is going to devour 10, 20, 30 pieces of content in a very deep manner, probably mediated by Google. Right?
Unavoidable.
Unavoidable. So Google is the gatekeeper, right? And then they're going to go through that list to be like, okay, I want to learn everything about this company, right? Or I want to learn everything about, like you said, like who's going to win, Shopee, Grab, or GoTo, right? So I think those are the things that kind of like,
which goes back to one of the things you said earlier, which is it's really about finding those people, right? Finding those like few hundred founders, for example, who are asking those questions, or finding sort of like this future generation of Southeast Asia founders or Southeast Asia investors who are trying to learn about the ecosystem, right? And it's really about finding that right audience who will actually fit that pull strategy, as you mentioned.
I think that's an interesting thing, right? Because it just feels like there's this trend, I think, of more and more thought leadership. I mean, obviously, I think, and also not just a function, of course, of VCs learning from the States, but also I think it's a function of like the entire ecosystem is getting smarter, right? Because the truth is, 10 years ago, I don't think anybody in Southeast Asia really had the credibility to write about how to hire your VP sales for a unicorn exit. And those people didn't really exist. I mean, they could write about it, but not in a very credible or very distributed way, right? But now I think there's a lot more folks who, they just go on Medium and they type something up, and then we all reshare it via WhatsApp and say like, hey, it's useful.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point. I mean, you have now the concept of like the mafia, right? Like you have people from these like unicorn companies that have like exited, for example, and are have that credibility, as you mentioned, to be able to talk about what it took to go from 0 to 100, and so with all that validation, like it ties in with what we mentioned earlier about the questions becoming more sophisticated, right? As a function of people gaining more experiences and companies maturing and all of these like validation happening for these different companies, then people start to ask more sophisticated questions, and then that increases the demand for these types of thought leadership, which people with a lot more time these days in the pandemic have the time to actually fulfill, right? So you have a lot more people starting podcasts, blogs, and all of that stuff.
Yeah, and I think that's the crux of it, right? Which is like, I was writing, and it feels like at one level we're trying to make it, as a result, to make it more useful, we had to become more niche, right? We had to get more specific on a topic to really get that nice juice. But then it feels almost like contradictory, because the other push is like, how do we make this go more viral, right?
That's actually an interesting problem, because I think I also face it I face it a lot in terms of like thinking about content. Like you obviously want to target a specific audience, but you're not exactly sure what questions they're asking, right? Obviously you want to answer all their questions, but it doesn't really make sense to do things one-on-one, obviously. Obviously there are different platforms for that, but when you think about how specific do you go, but at the same time you still want to create something that everybody can relate to, I think that's where the value of stories comes in, because like certain experiences or stories, they're still specific, so they're not predicated on like this applies to everybody, right? Like you still have that sort of message at the beginning, like this is their story, but at the same time when you listen to it, based on the way it's told, like people can take away different things from it, and in that sense, like a lot of people can still relate to it, right? So even if that story is about that particular company or that particular founder, I guess depending on the way it's told, and that's where our jobs come in, people can actually get different things from it.
Yeah, I think we're almost trusting that if we create a content that's designed for the niche, we're trusting that the algorithm will take us there, right? Google or whatever, right? Because I remember I was using TikTok, and I realized that I was getting pretty engrossed in it, because I think you figure out like the kind of comedy I like. So I love like comedy where people are making fun of like this terrible, but like how terrible their Chinese language skills are, or right. Americans showing off that they're really good at Mandarin, and like parodies of very stern Chinese teachers scolding you for your poor Mandarin grades, which is a very unique set of, school, comedy, which doesn't exist because I would never have gone on Google and typed in like Chinese literacy jokes slash comedy, right? But they can't figure it out, right? So it's interesting.
Yeah, I think that's it just goes back to that Henry Ford quote, right? About people not knowing what they want until you give it to them. And I guess for content that can be true, and I guess that adds a level of nuance to what we talked about earlier about this pull strategy, because sometimes we try to look for people who are asking questions, but sometimes they aren't even asking questions yet, but we could still reach out to them in a way and make them realize that they were actually interested or curious about this. And yeah, to an extent you do have to rely on these like platforms, not just Google but like Spotify, for example, for podcasts, to actually reach the type of audience you want to reach to, which again goes back to this importance of actually really choosing the right words, because all these algorithms base it, I mean, not just words and then now images as well, right? Because that's what the algorithms base their algorithms on, right? The words and the images that you use. So yeah.
Well, that's interesting, right? Because you and I were joking recently because I sent you a very congratulatory WhatsApp message to be like, hey, good job with the meme images that you've been deploying.
Yeah,
and you were like, yeah, it's all about the memes these days, right? So
yeah,
like what's up with the memes? I mean, they caught my eye and it made me laugh. And it got me to click. But is that working out as a strategy, or is that something that's more like you're personally interested in memes?
I think it's something that we, I think that this actually is an answer to one of the challenges that we mentioned earlier about how can you go niche, but at the same time still attract, or create relatable content, right? And I think memes is one of that, because memes are sort of a language in themselves. And at the same time, you can transpose whatever specific topic you want onto that meme, and then send it out, and then people could actually, even if they're not entirely familiar with what exactly the context of that meme is, they might still find it funny for some other reason that you yourself, the creator, didn't really know. So I think that was quite intentional on my part to actually start using memes in my blog post, in the blog post in the Insignia Business Review. And yeah, I guess it's been working well. I mean, the fact that you kindly shared it in the in this chat for around memes, and we've been seeing more people, I guess, like engage. I guess it helps, especially with social media, because you post the talk about the blog, but it doesn't really necessarily get people to read it. And I guess the memes sort of serve as a hook, I guess. It's like, oh, that's an interesting meme, funny meme. Like, what's the context? why did they share that meme? And then that's when they check things out.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth there, right? Because I think it creates curiosity, right, about a meme, right? Because the meme is such a easily digested, 1 second, scan, consumption piece. So it's a great way to get someone's attention. It creates curiosity and it creates humor, right? And I think they always say, like, if you can make someone laugh, then you've already persuaded them of the argument. So
yeah, right.
So it's funny because you're like, okay, like memes as thought leadership, that's because like memes is very lowbrow, right? Lowbrow, right? It feels like it, right?
Yeah, I guess it's something that you wouldn't really associate with, I guess, like an industry like VC that is very like serious and all about like numbers and stuff like that, and then suddenly you introduce memes. But I mean, like, that's actually where you can get get people to actually engage with the content is when they're not necessary, because like the people that you want to engage with are you're trying to share content that they think about almost like 24/7, right? And so memes are sort of a way to catch them in unawares, right? It's like they're not, you don't really want to stress them out about thinking about all these other things, but then you try to make it a little bit more casual, a little bit funny in a way, and that brings them back to the more serious topics that you want to share about.
Yeah, that's a lot of truth there. I mean, that's the tricky part, right? It's just like, you're trying to talk about some serious topics, which is niche, higher level stuff. And then you're also going like trying to digest it so that it's convenient and fun to consume. And I think there's also like if I look at the stuff I've been reading, that's also, I do feel like I'm reading way more than I used to as a kid, right? Because as a kid, I used to read encyclopedias with the illustrations,
right,
and that was fun, right? And then somewhere in the middle, it became very boring with all the textbooks with no images, just text. And I was just struggling to get through. While in parallel, I was watching like G.I. Joe and these cartoons, right?
Right.
Spider-Man and things like that. And then now I think that feels like these two things are kind of like coming back together, where we're trying to make them accessible and fun to learn, which is interesting, right? And I think I don't know, it's a challenge even for me when I think about what I consume and create.
Where I guess a few years ago, like people were sort of discounting social media. I guess pre 2010, for example, like it's just sort of like a fun thing that kids do, like myself when I started my account before 2010. Just like a fun thing, add people, like, say hi to people, etc., etc. But then, like suddenly you find all of these like different use cases for like, for social media in particular. And all of a sudden it's become like a crucial part to any firm strategy, and it's become sort of integrated in how like you deliver messaging and all of that. And yeah, I guess it's it's certainly part of the way we do things now.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? Because it feels like, the truth of messaging apps is that it feels like millennials and Zoomers, anybody who's a founder, nobody reads the Financial Times or the big article magazines as much. It's like a lot of it's like WhatsApp, Facebook. I've consumed most of my news that way. Do you feel like that resonates with you?
Yeah, I think it on some level that's if you think about it in terms of like a funnel, then definitely these messaging apps are definitely at the top, right? Because like you don't really have the time to like read everything, and so you just like go through this menu of sort of different titles that people are sharing, or interesting, say memes that you see, and then sort of links that follow. And then that's where you start to choose like, oh, which one am I actually, gonna spend 5 to 10 minutes to actually read through, if I actually want to read. And then there's even that question if you're even sort of that type of person who reads, right? Like some people just want to consume their information through video or podcasts, for example, which has created that whole new space for us who are interested in podcasts. So definitely, messaging is certainly a part of it. But then you also have to think about, trying to translate a piece of content into as many different media as possible, right?
Yeah, there's something that I noticed that you've been an expert and master at doing, right? Which is that content waterfall of like you're producing in one type of content, but then you're allowing the consumer to consume multiple formats of that same content, whether it's like listening or reading or whatever, right?
Yeah, you just want to try and I guess in the beginning it was more of trying to figure out like what will stick, like what the audience really wants to consume. But now it's more of I guess it's more of the realization that there are people want to consume different things. Let's just try to accommodate as much as possible. So for example, we do an interview with a founder or a guest, and then that podcast could there's a transcript, and then we turn that into an article, and then obviously that gets turned into a social media post, and you create memes for that social media post. And then more recently we started doing TikToks as well, so you could turn like some of the insights there into a TikTok, and then now you've created out of that one interview you've created like a bunch of different content, which then could be recycled actually. And which is one of the great things about doing these types of content, specifically around like the stories of founders, for example, or around the insights of investors, because I mean, to some extent they can be quite timeless, even if they are referring to specific events in history. Like they could still, people could still find wisdom in them. Like, for example, in with when the pandemic hit, all of a sudden everybody's asking all these investors who were in the '08 crisis and the '02, '03 crisis to start talking about what their thoughts were at that time, right? So there's that certain rhyme and repetition that comes with content, and that makes the job, I guess, in some ways easier, because then you don't necessarily have to create or reinvent the wheel all the time. Like you can just refer to things that you've done in the past and then reuse that or repackage it in a different way. Maybe a book that you've done, maybe you can splice it up and then get some quotes, turn those quotes into TikToks or memes, and then share it around, and then that could be content that anybody could use.
Do you feel like it's a lot of work to like repurpose all that stuff, and do you think it pays off?
Yeah, I think it pays off in the sense that you are trying to get different people through different types of content. Like for example, with a social media post, like you wanna, like for example on Instagram, like typically a lot of Indonesians on Instagram, so that could be a bit more targeted towards them, or a lot younger founders on Instagram, for example. And then TikTok is for even an even younger audience, potential interns, or potential people who might be interested in joining these companies as fresh grad hires. And then you have like newsletters or blogs that are more for I guess older people who are more used to reading things. And then podcasts for people who prefer to listen to different things. So I think it is worth it, because you are trying to, and it's important to have that awareness that you are targeting different people for these different types of cross-pollination, so to speak, in terms of the content. It's definitely important to be aware of that, so that you don't feel that you're just doing this sort of repetition for nothing. Because then you realize, oh, I'm actually catering to different people, and there's actually value in sort of recycling this content and actually repurposing it or repackaging it.
Yeah. I mean, I think it goes back to what you said, right? It's like there's I don't think it pays off in the short term, but I think it pays off of like you said, the long term, right? Because like you said, it's kind of classic, right? I think there's a bunch of content you did about the pandemic, right? And if there's a pandemic in 20 years time, again,
yeah, people will definitely ask questions. Oh, how were businesses during that time?
Exactly. Hopefully there isn't another pandemic, but to some extent it's evergreen, right?
Right.
And then obviously you say like, it's not only a story about pandemic, right? It's also a story about adversity. It's a story about an economic recession. It's a story about geopolitical conflict and turmoil.
Right.
So, and all those different themes can come out again and again, right? So, I'm just kind of curious. Like obviously you're thinking so much about all this stuff. Like, what do you consume? I'm kind of curious. Like, what do you because you're producing all this stuff, right? And I'm just kind of curious, like, what do you consume? So you mentioned, like, I guess you consume First Round Review, A16Z, I guess the Brave podcast,
Yeah. I mean, I do have a lot of different blogs and podcasts that I look up to. I mean, especially in the first few months that I started listening to podcasts at all, I was definitely a fan of like the Startup by Gimlet, which since finished in quite a spectacular fashion. Actually, they talked about their acquisition by Spotify, and then like all these different like resources and blogs, like Scott Galloway, although he's not really like purely a tech commentator, like he just comments about the economy, like the U.S. economy in particular and U.S. society in particular. And then there's also Ben Evans, who's a bit more of like Europe, U.S. plus Europe, and Stratechery as well, more in the business model side of things. So it's just like a bunch of different sources that I don't necessarily seek them out. It's more of like I just go on Twitter, for example, or go on different social media and then scroll through and then spot, oh, this seems interesting, or this author seems worth following. Then you start to follow, then you start to consume. Yeah, I don't necessarily search for specific things. I just like expose myself to as much as possible. And obviously, at work and even amongst like peers in the industry or friends, like we do share like a bunch of different articles around, and you have all these different chat groups and all of that. And that's where I, get the stuff that I consume. Yeah. And that's just, that's just the startup stuff, right?
Do you feel like the solution is just to be like, here's an interesting topic that someone talked about in America, so let's just localize it to the Southeast Asia region? Is that one way to think about it? Or how? Because I think that's how sometimes I think about it, right? It's like I read this thing about, I don't know, safe notes, right? And I'm like, okay, this is quite different from Southeast Asia, right? Because not everybody gets to use a safe. There's like the care node in Singapore. There's a bunch of different structures as well. Sometimes I read something about China and I'm like, okay, you know, that's not the same from a Southeast Asia perspective versus the US perspective. So maybe I should localize that. I don't know. How do you think about it? Is that something you think about?
I mean, that's definitely a part of it. I'd say like you'd be a fool not to actually focus on those things. I mean, all those like 3 questions that you mentioned are all like different sources of content already. Like you could just write an article to answer each of those questions that you just asked. And that's definitely something that we do as well. I mean, the book that I mentioned earlier, Navigating ASEANnovation, is precisely an example of that, right? Like Yinglan wrote about China's tech ecosystem a few years back. And then now that Southeast Asia's like getting pretty hot and there's a lot of questions about the region, now, you know, he thought it would be the right time and invited me on board as well to help out in writing this book. So yeah, I'd say like definitely a part of how, you know, content should be thought about like in this region. Think about it, like the people who are asking questions about the region actually experienced some of these things already, right? Like they either experienced, you know, investing in the US, for example, or they build a startup there, or you know, invest in China, so on and so forth. So they're definitely looking for the local version of things. Yeah, so there's definitely that audience, and you know, if there's that audience, then there's definitely room to create content for those kinds of questions.
Well, in parallel, I also know you run a fun hobby podcast, right? You know,
right.
So
Yes,
I want you to share a little bit about that before we start wrap things up here.
Yeah. Okay. I guess I wasn't really expecting to talk about this part, but yeah, since we've been talking about content, and yeah, content for me is really something that goes beyond the whole like startup ecosystem where I'm working in right now, right? Like it's just like at the core of it, I just really like to tell stories. I like to learn about the stories of other people, like to ask questions and then figure out, you know, where they're coming from. And in that spirit, like me and my friend, we started this podcast mainly just to have like a stream of consciousness, kind of like conversations, mainly about Asian culture, sort of our view on different things about Asian pop culture, from food to travel, and mostly music as well. So we talk about like K-pop, obviously. Then my friend is a little bit more versed in like Chinese pop, like Mando pop and rap and all of that stuff. So she talks about that as well. And we talk about a different variety of topics. And I think one of the more interesting things that we've done in this podcast is actually invite people to actually come on and share their own experiences following, being fans of like different aspects of Asian pop culture, from like esports to different K-pop groups to singing competitions, all of that. Yeah, so the podcast is called The Weekly Stand-Up. So it's like I guess it comes from the stan, no, this whole stan culture, and then we try to make it, since we were both like you know, fresh grads working our first jobs, we decided to, you know what, how can we make it very like sound corporate? It's like, so it's like weekly stand up, and then we remove the D, so it's like weekly stand up, and then yeah, so obviously we post weekly, and yeah, I mean, we're actually open to anybody coming on our show actually, and just sharing what they follow or what they quote unquote stan, right? Like as long as it's, I guess, related to Asian pop culture. So I guess even you, Jeremy, if there's something, if you have like a hidden passion for you know, certain music groups, or you know, or certain things that you want to share, then happy to have you on the show. Yeah.
My gosh, you're making me suddenly go to myself and say, oh my gosh, am I an Anglophile? Where you know, I gotta think through this. You know, what exactly Asian pop culture do I consume a lot of?
Right.
I guess not enough. I think that's something I've been starting to do a lot more with watching like the Parasite and the Host movies.
Right.
So I'm starting to like try to get back to it a little bit more.
Yeah. So sometimes we even have people on the show who are like never heard about K-drama or K-pop before, and then because of the pandemic, then they started discovering all these different things, and now they're hooked. So yeah, those are some interesting stories as well.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting part was just because, you know, I spent so much time like, you know, either like, you know, traveling for work, or like also being in the States, right? You know, working on my startup and growing
Right.
blah. And I think what happened was that it's just like at the end of the day, it was just way too hard to consume Asian. At least to me, right? You know, like because it's just
the exposure isn't just there. Yeah.
Yeah, because you walk into any movie and it's all your Hollywood movies, right? So you can just talk about Fast and Furious. I don't like watching Fast and Furious. But if you did watch it, you could connect with everybody in the world simultaneously, right? Or you watch like Transformers or like these like more like universal properties, right? Like Harry Potter. Then you get to like, and it's universally consumable and is universally community, right? You know,
right.
Whereas I think the interesting part about it was like, I think this pandemic has helped me actually kind of get a little bit more niche in the content I'm consuming as well.
But I guess like just to comment on that quickly, it's like it's at this point, like I think it's becoming less and less niche in a way. Because like even if you see even like with interviews with like Hollywood stars, you know, there's always a question of like, oh, what K-pop are you listening to now? And then they always say either like BTS or Blackpink, right? And it's sort of become part and parcel of what people consider to be, you know, pop culture. And I mean that's just K-pop, right? And there's obviously other things that are up and coming. And so yeah, I definitely think like Asian pop culture in terms of like the global perception of what is pop is definitely carving a slice out of that. And yeah, so it's really exciting, just as exciting as it is to watch Southeast Asian startups get a lot more attention from investors, right? It's that same kind of like increased exposure, and definitely, you know, you definitely need a lot of like content creators like you and me to start talking about these things.
So we're like K-pop bands and singers, maybe.
Right. I mean, not necessarily the singers, but we have to. Are you familiar with the game and also a Netflix TV series called The Witcher?
I watched the Netflix show. Yeah, definitely.
Right. Yeah, I mean, in the show there was the bard, right? He sings the song like "Toss a coin to your Witcher," and I think like in a way like we're not the Witchers, right? But we are like that bard. Who actually like composes the song, tells the story of The Witcher, and to an extent, the songs even reach more than the actual show to an extent, or actual story to an extent, or even the character itself. Yeah, because for example, like for that specific example, you see people covering that song, who aren't necessarily following the show under you know SoundCloud, Twitch streams, or whatever. And in that way, I guess it's sort of similar to what we do, right? Like in terms of content, like it just makes you realize how impactful telling a story can be.
I love that the Witcher analogy. Like, what is it? Toss a coin to your Witcher.
Yeah.
So we're like bots, is it? You know?
Right. Yeah.
And then the Witcher's just like, shut up. You know, it's just like, stop following me. Stop chronicling my journey. My journey is totally normal. It sucks. You know, it's very tough.
Which is actually not like a foreign response from some founders or investors, right? They'll be like, you know, like, why are you telling my story? Or like, why are you so interested in following me? Something like that. Yeah. So
I mean, yeah, there's a lot of truth to that, right? Because I think to them, they're living it, so it doesn't feel interesting.
Right.
It's not inspiring to them, right? You know, because it's themselves, right? And they also see all the tough times, and then, like you said, right, the bot is like there to kind of like, not, you know, obviously have fun in one way, but also like to show the real reality of it, right?
And actually, like, so not just show the real reality, but also make it, in a way, turn it into a quote unquote artifact that people will actually want to listen to, right? Because if the bard had just like told the story and just said "toss a coin to your Witcher," blah blah blah, and not sung it, then I probably wouldn't actually remember those words, right? But because he sung it in that melody in that way, and then repeated it and all those different things, then it sort of like becomes an earworm and it sticks in your head, and I actually reference it a few months later on, right? So I think there's definitely those two elements of showing the reality and then actually packaging it in a way that people actually remember it.
You know, I love this analogy so much. I mean, I think that's a perfect piece. Yeah, you're right, because without the melody, without the arrangement, you know, it's just, you know, if you read out the lyrics to The Witcher, it'd be the most boring thing on earth. So I guess instead of like us being a bard, we just slap memes as cover art, you know, and make it more digestible, right, for folks.
Right.
Yeah. So obviously, kind of starting to wrap things up here, but obviously things haven't always been easy for you, right, over time, because you're juggling. You did that transition from university to VC, and then you've been very much pioneering thought leadership in this approach, in this geography as well. So could you share in your past some difficulties that you overcame and when you were brave?
Sort of the difficulties, I guess, especially in relation to that transition, the transitions that I mentioned earlier, is definitely trying to adjust and sort of find my own rhythm to life, I guess. As you're, for one, transitioning from university to your first job, and then two, like this job isn't like a full-time job. There's no, like, you're not going to the office every day. You're not reporting to someone all the time. But you do have things that you want to accomplish. And so finding that sort of like self-motivation and discipline to an extent was something of a challenge for me as well. Like, especially because when you're stuck at home and it's easy to just like go to your bed, fall asleep, or end up doing something else entirely. You really have to find that why and that purpose. And not just that, I think, because like a lot of people put a premium on the why and the purpose, finding all of that stuff. But I think it's also about finding what I would say are like believers, right? Like finding people, could be friends, could be your family, could be your colleagues as well, who actually not just support you, but it can actually hold you accountable to what you want to achieve, right? And I think this applies not just to work, but anything goal related, right? Anything that you want to do in life. You do have to find that group of people, like those believers who you can actually talk to when things are going tough in terms of like achieving that goal, or when you're getting bogged down, or just like reminding you that there's still more to it, and there's still a lot that you can do. So I guess that's sort of the challenge that I've been having over the past year, more than a year, I guess. And with the whole uncertainty with the pandemic, you're not really sure about, I'm not really sure about what the working conditions will be, like how I'll be working in the next year, next couple of months. But I'm sort of grounded by the fact that I'm doing these like new and exciting things every day, every month. And that keeps me, awake at night sometimes, but it also wakes me up in the morning to actually energize me and get me through the rest of the day. Yeah. I guess I didn't really answer your question about being brave though, but I guess to quickly address that one, I think one of the things, I wouldn't like necessarily cite a specific instance, but I think one of the things that I've had to learn to do, and I wish I had been taught more as a student, was sort of how to say no. And I qualify this in the sense that, like, especially if you grow up in an environment where you're always encouraged to be like a go-getter, right? And especially in the startup scene, it's always like, you always gotta, fake it till you make it, move fast, break things, and there's always that kind of like, to an extent, a yes culture involved, right? Say yes to the challenges, overcome it, etc., etc. But at the same time, you have to know which battles you want to fight, right? And which ones are worth putting your time in. And I think that's the kind of bravery, I think, that isn't really talked about that often, and something that I've had to face a couple of times. Thinking about where I wanted to work after university, like, because obviously that's when you start to realize that saying yes to one means saying no to a bunch of other things that could potentially, in your mind, or when you're talking to these different companies, at least, like, you start to think like, oh, this could be exciting, and then you start to think about opportunity costs and all of that. That's when you start to learn how to say no, I guess, in a way. And obviously this is a 23-year-old speaking, right? But I guess as you grow older, like, you definitely learn to say no more, a lot often. And to some people that could be, obviously in pop culture, that has been represented by as part of like being old and sort of being a lot more restricted, right? And there's some pushback on that. But at the same time, I think if you really want to be sort of find meaning and find value and find something that you really want to do in life, then you do have to end up choosing one thing over the other, right? There's definitely like an opportunity cost to everything. So yeah, like I mean, I experienced it when I had to choose my first job, and even when I like had to choose my course for university. And yeah, I guess it's kind of tough when you're sort of grow up in an environment where it's all about saying yes, and it's quite easy to say yes actually. So yeah, like that's definitely how I've experienced it. I'm pretty sure I'm gonna experience it a lot more often in the future.
Yeah,
so definitely excited
definitely
for that.
I think
but
the
but
shade
yeah.
has become more subtle and complicated, and then the no's and yeses become more subtle as well and intricate. So thank you so much for coming to the show. There are three things that I really enjoyed from this conversation. Right. The first, of course, was your triple jump from student to professional, from consumer to producer, and from startups to VC, right? And I really appreciate the tips that you gave for people on, the things that you consume in terms of media, how you think of new ideas to create content, and also to some extent, the bravery and the learnings to be able to say no, right, in those career transitions for trade-offs. The second thing I really enjoyed so far has, of course, your thought leadership, right? I think your 10x versus anybody else in the VC thought leadership space in Southeast Asia, because there's nobody else. And so I think lots of great thoughts around what success is, how to measure it, how to think about it, how to produce, how to do a waterfall. And lastly, of course, thank you so much for the wonderful analogy of the bard, right, from The Witcher. That was definitely, a true point, right?
Yeah,
because,
The Witcher.
I think it's the part where, we're not pretending to be the hero of the story, but, we're helping to both articulate what's actually going on in the hero's journey, but also packaging it nice and tight with a nice musical melody and some memes, right? So thank you so much for that, Paulo.
Yeah, and I think it was definitely a pleasure to be at least for the past hour, be sort of a witcher in a way, and then thank you for being such a great bard. I'm definitely learning a lot as well as a fellow podcaster, as a fellow interviewer, right? Of and sort of how you handle interviews. So it's really great to be on the show, and I really appreciate that you were able to find a lot of these things helpful. Hopefully your listeners also find some of these things interesting to listen to and find helpful as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Paulo.
Yeah. And one more thing, I guess, is, if you're listening to the Brave podcast, then you'll probably also like listening to On Call with Insignia Ventures, our podcast as well. Available everywhere you listen to podcasts. And hit follow for both our podcasts, and you pretty much joined the club, the all-exclusive club of Southeast Asia content creators. But anyway, and also check out the book, Navigating ASEANnovation, especially if you're just breaking into sort of the startup ecosystem and want to learn more about this region in particular, how companies have been braving through the pandemic and being resilient, and what are the new interesting business models or companies that we're looking at in the region, then definitely check out that book. It's on Amazon, and I think in Singapore it should still be in bookstores like Kinokuniya. Yeah. So thanks again, Jeremy.
Thank you so much, Paulo. Thank you for listening to Brave. If you enjoyed this podcast, please share this episode with friends and colleagues. Sign up at www.jeremyau.com to discuss this episode with other community members in our forum. Stay well and stay brave.